My name is Pushkar Sohoni. I represent the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research in Pune. At IISER Pune, we have decided this semester to have a series of 4 lectures, one every month, September, October, November, and December, on the changing nature of the Indian state. And it is my great pleasure to invite Dr. Deshpande today to kick off this series. She's a professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at the Savitribai Phule Pune University. And her specialization really is on Indian politics and political thinking in India. She has published widely and extensively in journals and also authored a number of monographs. Her resume, which is far too voluminous to read out here, is available online. So if anybody is interested, please do Google her name like I did last month and be dazzled by a sterling record of research, teaching, and publication. Without further ado, I would invite her to start. So please, welcome.
Yes, so I'm glad that you have initiated a dialogue on Indian democracy, as Pushkar just mentioned. And it's very rare for the science community to be alert about politics. But not only that, the idea that you want to discuss certain nuances of politics in all its details, it's something that I found interesting about this series, and I'm very glad to be a part of it. Let me begin with a few preliminaries. And Pushkar, please tell me if it is okay, I speak for 40 minutes or so.
Absolutely fine.
Yeah. So let me begin with a few preliminaries. The first is that we are talking about Indian state. And it's not only a colossal kind of entity, but also a very complex entity, as all of you know, because not only does it rule over 1/6 of the humanity, but it also touches upon every aspect practically of their lives, every sixth person on earth probably. Ranging from controlling their sexuality, just to give you the sense of its complexity, ranging from controlling their sexuality to sort of accumulation of capital and foreign affairs, and everything is taken care of by the Indian state. And the Indian constitution also assigns certain additional responsibilities to it, apart from what is expected from a standard modern capitalist state. So in that sense, it becomes a very complex kind of entity, which envelops into it many kind of responsibilities, many kind of functions, and these functions are sort of condensed within the Indian state. This is mainly because of its post-colonial status of the state, but also because of its status as a democratic state, as I would like to talk about later on, and also because of its status as a developmental or welfare state. So as I said, these are certain additional responsibilities. There are certain additional responsibilities that the Indian state handles apart from its, so to say, regulatory and extractive functions. So these educative, developmental functions are also a part of the agenda of Indian state. And as a result, it develops a very complex agenda for itself. And it has some kind of a very layered existence, the idea a post-independence Indian state has. Just to keep it with us. The second point that I would like to share with you is that since today we are going to talk about the changing character of the Indian state, it of course involves a long-term overview, a long-term view of the functioning of the state. And naturally, therefore, obviously, it is going to be a sketchy overview, maybe a painting in, not so good painting, but painting in broad strokes, rather than looking at the nuances. We are going to miss a lot many nuances and details, and perhaps we can take those up later in the discussion, these subtleties. The third thing, actually needless to say, but this of course is one of the many readings of Indian state and its functioning, because many of you know that there has been an extensive scholarship, a very enriching kind of scholarship around the functioning of the state in general, but more particularly about the Indian state, which ranges from theories of modernization and more sophisticated theories of modernization to the varieties of Marxist theories. So there have been many simultaneous readings of the functioning of Indian state, and I would definitely encourage, urge the students in this audience to read more about it whenever they wish. But this is only one kind of a very humble reading of the functioning of the Indian state. Finally, and perhaps more importantly, as far as the preliminaries are concerned, although we said that the Indian state develops a very complex agenda for itself and dons many kinds of hats, so to say, I'm going to talk about Indian state mainly as a democratic state. And that is, I'm going to prioritize its role as a democratic state. And I can say that there are three reasons for this, why I'm today prioritizing its role as a democratic state. The first, of course, is the fact that you have initiated this conversation on Indian democracy. So it becomes a very appropriate kind of discussion for me that we talk about the state and democracy interaction and look at the Indian state as a democratic state primarily, although, as I said, it has a very complex existence. Secondly, more importantly, we can say that this idea of democracy and the establishment of democracy in 1947 perhaps marks the most important rupture in the career of the Indian state. It marks the most important historical juncture at which we should inspect and start inspecting the career of the Indian state. Because as you know, many of you know, as far as the state apparatus, what we call as the state apparatus is concerned, the instruments of the state, the organization of the government, its three branches, etc., the details of organization of the government are concerned. This state apparatus was mainly, it continued from the colonial period. So we have borrowed a lot from the colonial state as far as the state apparatus is concerned, as far as the organization of the state is concerned. But then what changes in post-independence period is its justificatory logic, which emerges in the form of the fact that now it would be a democratic state. Now it would be an accountable state. It would be responsible to the people. So I thought that this idea of democracy becomes central to our discussion of the Indian state because of this distinctive, very distinctive nature of this idea. But finally, thirdly, to continue with this idea of a very distinctive nature of democracy in India and elsewhere also, is the fact that democracy operates at two levels. It opens up certain subtexts in its operation. So we know democracy as a kind of system of governance. We know democracy as a kind of aspirational ideology, liberating ideology, because of the element of representativeness which is engulfed in democracy. But at the same time, as far as Indian state is concerned, it also becomes a legitimating ideology for the state. So the state's legitimacy is drawn essentially on the basis of its democratic character. And so democracy in a way plays this dual role. It also becomes an instrument at the hands of the state, so that it could retain its legitimacy by using the idea of democracy at various levels. And we will talk about this point later on also in the course of today's talk. But I thought that this becomes a very interesting aspect for us to talk about Indian state as a democratic state, because democracy gives a certain kind of defining character to the modern Indian state, to the post-independence Indian state. So that's why the discussion today is mainly about Indian state as a democratic state and its career. It's the changing nature of its career, its character. So we try and judge the character of the Indian state. How exactly do we do it? What do we mean by the character of the Indian state, and how do we judge it? So just for the sake of convenience, I mean, we can go into details, conceptual details later on, but just for the sake of convenience, I would say that it is possible to know how exactly the state processes the democratic claims, various kinds of democratic claims, which are put to it, which are presented to it. The state has to deal with these various kinds of democratic claims. And in other words, how did the Indian state deal with various democratic claims throughout its career over the past 70, 75 years? So that could be one kind of an inquiry to understand the character of the Indian state, the nature of the Indian state. These democratic claims, by democratic claims, I mean various mobilizational claims. And we can, again, for the sake of convenience, in order to discuss it, make it possible, the discussion possible within 40, 45 minutes, just for collective convenience, we can say that these democratic claims, the mobilizational claims that we are talking about, can be roughly categorized into two varieties. There are two varieties of claims. They could be broadly about representation, ranging from politics of what we call as politics of presence, where actual presence of certain social communities or certain individuals is expected in the functioning of the government, functioning of the governance, democratic governance and political governance. Ranging from that to the claims of representation of certain interests. They may not demand actual presence in politics and in political offices, but their interests should be represented. But whole range of, we can say, claims of representation, one kind of claims. And as in the peculiar, again, in the peculiar Indian context, but more generally also, as far as democratic states are concerned, and as we know, most of these democratic states these days are welfare states, some kind of welfare states. So there will be claims related to distribution. Distribution of capital, distribution of welfare, distribution of economic resources, distribution of symbolic resources. But we can club together all these claims. We can club together as distributive claims. And broadly, we can say democratic politics is about representation, and it is about certain kind of an demand for distribution or certain kind of a claim on the resources, both actual resources, physical resources, economic resources, as well as symbolic resources. So that could be, again, another starting point for this discussion. So we want to know how these two kinds of claims, which were presented to the state, how did the state address those claims? How did the state process those claims? And whether whether an understanding of this process leads us to develop a certain kind of comment on the nature of Indian state, on the character of the Indian state. Okay. And as you can see, I mean, in that sense, although I said that we will prioritize essentially the democratic aspect of functioning of the state, the discussion becomes comprehensive once you take into account the fact that democratic claims could be about anything and everything, and it touches upon issues of development, it touches upon issues of regulation, it also sometimes most probably touches upon issues of political culture, etc. We'll come back to this discussion later on. But my point is that it is through this framework that perhaps we will be able to understand the changing character of the Indian state. So how did it happen? How did the Indian state process these two kinds of claims which were presented to it over a period of time at various historical junctures? Now here, I would like to propose that we can, again, it is for the sake of conceptual convenience. It is basically to simplify the matters, because we are reading here distinct plural histories of functioning of the state. But in order to bring them together and create a certain kind of abstraction in terms of understanding of the functioning of Indian state, we can say that there has been a gradual unfolding of three kinds of stages in which the Indian state has developed its character, has developed its career. And there are three ways of processing of the claims that we can sort of discern in this discussion. One is accommodation, the strategy of accommodation. We can say that the state used three kinds of strategies as far as processing of these claims and its behavior is concerned. So what were these three strategies? Perhaps the first was accommodation of certain claims. The second was manipulative practices encouraged by the state, and the way in which it tried to appropriate certain democratic issues that were presented to it. And finally, it is also about exclusion, a near total exclusion, we can say. So there is a kind of constant interplay of democracy and state taking place in India over the past 75 years. And as far as this interplay is concerned, the state tries to use different strategies to participate in this interplay and to, in a way, control democracy or expand democracy, possibly also try to use democracy as its legitimating ideology, constantly tries to use democracy as a tool for its legitimation. Although we can, discern these three sort of strategies, again, as I said, for the sake of convenience, actually, I want you to imagine a kind of line at one end of which perhaps we can talk about the ideal democratic order, very inclusive kind of social order, which is facilitated by the state. And at the other extreme, we can talk about complete distortion of democracy. And most of the states, modern capitalist states, and therefore in Indian state also, would operate somewhere on the line. The more it moves to the left side, the more it moves towards more inclusive strategies, perhaps the extent of manipulations of democracy reduces to a certain extent. And the more it moves to the right, the extent of manipulations getting converted into exclusionary practices, manipulations transforming into exclusionary practices, this possibility increases. So we can imagine a kind of line on which the behavior of the state could be plotted. And we can, just for the sake of convenience, we can draw certain phases on this line, or certain intervals on that line. And the point that I'm trying to say here is that manipulations, if you consider democracy as essentially a tool, a legitimating ideology for the state, this idea of manipulations, appropriations, selective appropriations of the democratic claims remains a permanent feature, really, in the career of any state, I would say, but more particularly, since we are talking about Indian state, in the career of Indian state. So Indian state has constantly tried to selectively appropriate and manipulate the democratic claims. But in the first phase, and I'm not going to spend much time on that first phase because it is now an ancient history, and we have maligned it also a lot these days. But I would say that my interest is more about the post-1990 phase, where democracy acquires sort of a new character. Democracy itself becomes different, and democracy itself expresses itself in various trajectories, and how then the state processes the democratic claims which are presented to it. But we can say that if at all we want to spare a minute on the accommodative strategies, we can say that roughly we are talking about Nehru era. And generally, it is believed why we can say that it was the strategies of accommodation were used by the state and that they were successful and they benefited Indian society and democracy, because the state was generally seen as more capable at that time. The state was generally seen as more successful in entertaining and processing, resolving the democratic disputes, the democratic claims. It could be the example of linguistic states, or it could be regional autonomy, the issues of regional autonomy. It could be about princely states. It could be about land reforms. So at all these levels, the state was seen as successful. And therefore, it is often suggested that this was a phase when the state was successful and it was more inclusive. It entertained the democratic claims. It encouraged democratic mobilizations also through Panchayat Raj and many other institutional advances. And therefore, there is a gradual degeneration of the state. There could be one reading that from this stage of accommodation, successful accommodation of the representative and distributive claims, we degenerate into near exclusionary discourses of state at the moment. But I don't think that would be a very correct kind of reading, in the sense that manipulations, selective appropriations of the democratic issues, selective appropriation of the issues of representation and distribution happened at that time also. But these appropriations and these manipulations remained muted in a sense, because they happened only mainly at the interinstitutional level. So I won't spend much time on it, but you can go back to the debates between legislature and judiciary over property rights. And here the legislature had an upper hand also around that time, as a result of which we see a certain kind of success of the state as well as certain kind of success of democracy. But my point is that manipulations do remain a feature of the functioning of the state even at that time, as far as our judgment of the character of Indian state is concerned. Although they were subtle or although they were muted, they were there. At the same time, we also need to say that as far as this period is concerned, the logic of democracy, the idea of democracy as a legitimating ideology also prevailed in the functioning of the state. And therefore, the state had to sort of, the state was forced to respect, in a way, the democratic logic at various levels, although it was a very limited exercise of democracy. As you know, the first few elections when Congress won, there was a very limited expansion of democracy in India, but therefore the state could encourage democratic mobilizations and it could invest in democratic process. That was the first phase. We can skip emergency just for the sake of it today, because we know that this was a brief period of a brief interlude of repressive strategies. The state used repressive strategies, but they were overturned, they were subverted quickly. And therefore I'm just skipping it. But as I said, more interesting part in the career of Indian state, and that is something that should also interest the students of contemporary political history, like all of you, is the post-1990 period. And there, I would like to propose that there the state mainly used manipulative strategies for its function. And the state selectively processed the democratic claims that arrived at that time and that were presented to it through mobilizational politics. You know that 1990s, where we are talking about essentially the decline of Congress and arrival of a multi-party system, a more competitive party system, as far as the electoral democracy is concerned. Democracy is of course not confined to electoral democracy, as I have been suggesting, but it is also about mobilizational politics. It is also about politics of interests. But as far as the mainstream manifestation of democracy is concerned, the electoral democracy, we see a quick transformation or a gradual transformation, if we may call it that way, from one party dominant system to a multi-party dominant system. It is not only at the level of party system, but we can say that there was a large scale participation of various social groups in the democratic exercise at the state level, at the local level, at the national level during this period. So 1990s again mark a kind of rupture in the career of Indian democracy, we can say, but also therefore in the career of the Indian state. Because now as democracy matured in the sense of increased participation of the hitherto marginalized sections of democracy, it grew in a very untidy manner. As you know, it was a very chaotic situation in the 1990s, and we had coalition governments and we were not sure whether there would be political stability, etc. But this untidy or noisy, what Atul Kohli calls as a noisy democracy, this arrived because of the participation of the marginalized sections increased a great deal. And as a result of this, there were several trajectories, several complicated again and uneven trajectories of democracy that were unleashed during this period. The state had to deal with so many issues, we can say. Issues of representation, issues of distribution. although the social movements had declined, social movements per se had declined at that time, it was mainly through party politics. It was mainly through the mainstream political machinery that these democratic claims of various social sections and citizens were articulated, and the state had to deal with them. Okay, so many simultaneous strategies. So what did the state do? How did it address these various trajectories? I would say that the state mainly used manipulative strategies. So let me go back to the idea of manipulation for a minute, and then we can come back to these issues which the state had addressed during that time. What do we mean by manipulation? So we can look at 5 or 6 different features, different ways in which manipulation as selective appropriation of democracy, selective appropriation of the idea of democracy happened in India during this period. We can start with total suppression, a total exclusion and complete marginalization of certain kind of claims. And here I want you to connect to the idea of welfare and to the idea of poverty, perhaps, or the economic issues of economic stratification and issues of economic inequalities. As you know, in the new economic policy, when the new economic policy unveiled and the first phase of post-globalization, post-liberalization economic strategies unveiled, what the state tried to do was to insulate the economic logic, that is the logic of liberalization, from the political compulsions of democracy. So you would recall that all political parties, left and right, sort of agreed upon the agenda of economic liberalization during this period. And obviously, the claims of welfare, India being an extremely poor society, the claims of welfare actually need to be central claims in the functioning of democracy, but they were completely marginalized during this period. On the other hand, if you look at the other strategies, other manipulative strategies, other variety of manipulation, it was symbolic accommodation of certain claims. The state tried to accommodate, entertain certain claims or certain issues, but only at a symbolic level. And I think the best or the worst example of this phenomena could be the Women's Reservation Bill. There was a complete consensus about women's issues, and everybody agreed to women's empowerment, the idea of women's empowerment, but the bill was never passed. And the bill was never politically, so to say, addressed, because there were many issues raised by people. You would recall that if we are giving quota to women, then there should be a quota within quota for the backward caste, more marginalized sections, socially more marginalized sections of women. So this was a huge opportunity for the state to use the logic of intersectionality and resolve these issues in a political way, but that never happened. Instead of that, we don't see the Women's Reservation Bill anywhere on the horizon as yet. So symbolic accommodation, I would say. There is also a prioritization of certain kind of claims. The state decides the priorities, and because the state has huge powers in the social realm, Indian state has huge powers in the social realm, so it can decide priorities. And we can sort of condense the entire discussion around the majoritarian agenda that emerged at that time, and how the majoritarian claims. And here I'm not talking only about the BJP government. Many of you would recall that actually when Babri Masjid Ram Janmabhoomi controversy started, it was the Congress government, right? So both the Congress government and the BJP government later on, or BJP governments at state level, how did they process these claims on behalf of a religious majority, or what some people would now call as ethnic majority in India? And we can again imagine the issues ranging from Shah Bano verdict, Muslim Women's Bill, to the Hindutva judgments of the judiciary, and what Neeraja Gopal Jayal describes in one of her works as a majoritarian minoritism, so to say, which was entertained by the judiciary at that time. So prioritizing certain kind of claims, prioritizing the claims of Muslim men over those of Muslim women in the whole Shahabano Muslim Women's Bill controversy, for example. So prioritizing certain claims, and the state decides the priorities in that sense. Fourthly, the fourth strategy of manipulation that the Indian state used at that time, in dealing with democracy, was a token distribution of resources, what we may call as a very thin dispersal of resources. So there is some kind of an assurance that you will get some kind of benefits from the state, but these would be very thin, very notional, very symbolic, and therefore useless. And I think the best and the worst example of this strategy would be the politics of reservations. The whole range of issues which are covered in politics of reservations, and the way in which a robust anti-caste politics which emerged after Mandal was reduced to the problem of reservations, was reduced or kept revolving around the idea of reservations and kept revolving around the idea of quotas. This would be the worst example, where the state only ensured a very thin dispersal of resources and sort of manipulated the issue of caste-based injustices for so many marginalized sections, the Bahujans of Indian society. And the entire trajectory of the OBC politics, or the entire trajectory of politics of reservations, reveals these manipulations in a very clear way, as I said. And so also at some point of time, there was a complete redefining of the nature of claims. And again, the state encouraged these kind of redefinitions of the claim. You can also, in that connection also, you can check the journey of the category of OBCs, how this category evolves, and then how this politics of categories dominates the entire discussion of reservations till now. So this is something that the state did. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that it is with the help of these various manipulative strategies that the state tried to encourage selective inclusion of citizen classes in the democratic process, and also it encouraged selective exclusion. So selectively inclusion and exclusion, or selective appropriation of what people want, and was decided by the state, and the state tried to process it in a very selective manner. So so there were convenient tactics of acceptance and negation, or celebration sometimes, as I said, in case of women's issues, or subversion, and selective inclusion and exclusion. That is how the state dealt with democracy in the 1990s. Now, as a result of that, we know that during this entire period, the democratic politics, so to say, representative politics, remains full of contestations. There are all sorts of contestations, as a result of which it becomes unstable in that sense of the term, and there is a lot of chaos generally in politics. So full of contestations, but the state could not sort of resolve these contestations in a successful manner. And as a result of that, because the state succumbed to sort of this chaos, and instead what we see is that during the 90s, the state in fact encourages contestations. It does not resolve these contestations, but the state, in its various strategies and in its various policies, encourages further contestations among the groups of citizens. So it has to follow democratic logic. The state could not afford to leave democratic logic in the 1990s as far as this connect with democratic politics and use of ideology of democracy as legitimating ideology is concerned. But at the same time, it also loses its control over it and instead encourages contestation. So it could not win over the democratic logic. This led to paradoxical sort of implications, both for the state as well as for the Indian society. At one level, we can say that, since we are discussing democracy in this entire series, at one level, we can say that these contestations reduced in a way the closure of democracy, the possibility of closure of democracy, because contestations always remain lively expression in whatever form they were. We may not like them, many of us may not like those contestations, but they symbolized the possibility of expansion of democracy, because so many people participated and asserted their claims in the democratic realm. At the same time, as I said, because of the selective appropriations of these claims, the democratic chaos in a way masked the subordination of democratic claims, and so to say the idea of domination, the state domination was masked under these democratic contestations. The state's failures, we can say, especially on the distributive front, were also masked under these democratic contestations, so to say. But yet, the compulsions of democracy as a legitimate ideology remains intact till the 1990s. And in fact, it continues, I would say, although we are talking about 1990s as a kind of stereotype, but it continues till 2005 or almost 2009 elections, where in between, the rights revolution happens. So the state commits itself to again certain kind of thin dispersal of economic resources. And in fact, rights revolution or the social legislations that the UPA government brings in around that time becomes the first serious attempt in the post-liberalization period by the state to address issues of economic inequality and issues of welfare. But again, the state ensures only a kind of thin dispersal. Although we don't want to go into the details of these social legislations that the UPA government had brought in. Okay, so this continues, the idea of contestations and manipulations, overt manipulations by the state, selective appropriation of democracy by the state continues till 2009 almost. And then we come finally to the more contemporary period of the functioning of the state, the most recent or contemporary avatar, we can say, of the Indian state, which again, for the sake of convenience, we can say that it is the post-2014 period. But 2009 to 2014 can also become a part of this discourse. But post-2014, what happens, and this is where I would like to end also after discussing this more contemporary phase of politics. But what happens here is a very interesting kind of twist in the career of the state. And the state, I'm trying to propose to you by way of an argument in making, really, that the state completely takes over the democratic logic here. So it is no longer required for the state to follow the dictates of procedural democracy. There is an obvious connection to this submission that in the post-2014 period, one party emerges as the majority party, right, and wins majority of seats in the parliament. So as far as parliamentary democracy and the dictates of a parliamentary democracy, the idea of parliamentary democracy is concerned, there is already a certain kind of electoral majority manufactured or created, constructed, and which helps the state in winning over the democratic logic. But it is not only about parliamentary democracy that I'm talking today. The state uses, as a result of this possibility, which is created through electoral majority, the state uses various strategies which lead to substantive exclusion of the democratic logic, substantive exclusion of the democratic claims. At the same time, it is successful in creating a kind of alternative representative logic or alternative logic of democracy, which we may call for the moment a pseudo democratic logic. Okay, so there is a facade of representation. There is the idea of representation, the idea of participation, the idea of distribution remains intact at a certain level, but it is completely detached from the electoral logic of democracy, the procedural democracy, because democracy is also about certain procedures, and these procedures are bypassed. These procedures are subverted. The procedural democracy and therefore the substantive democracy is subverted to create a pseudo-democratic discourse, which is often described as populism in the post-2014 period. So what are the various sort of inner factors? What are the internal factors? What are the various components of this new sort of democratic discourse or new representative discourse, which actually subverts the nature of democracy, and the state no longer requires, we can say, procedural or electoral democracy as its legitimating logic, as the logic from which it draws its legitimacy. The state gains its legitimacy even otherwise. And why the state gains legitimacy even otherwise? Because there is a parallel sort of mock democratic logic which is unveiled in this period. I will just list out the factors which go in the making of this logic before I conclude. I hope it is okay, Pushkar.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I'll take another 5-7 minutes maybe. So again, 2014, or in fact after 2009, it's again a very interesting phase, a very important phase in the career of the global capitalist state in the context of the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. And many scholars, in the context of that financial crisis, many scholars have argued that this crisis represented actually a crisis of hegemony of the capitalist state. But and therefore the distributive claims, the claims of welfare for the poor, were again marginalized. They remain marginalized in this entire logic because the state faced a kind of crisis, and capitalism also, global capitalism also faced a kind of crisis in 2008 to 2009. So distribution marks the idea of this. As far as distributive claims are concerned, there is a total exclusion of these claims. They are completely sidelined in the discourse of the state, not only in the Indian context, but at the global level. So we can see the exclusion of poor in the policy discourse. Many recent examples like the labor laws and the farmers laws, or the way in which the state treated the informal sector workers during pandemic, etc. So as far as policy discourse is concerned, the poor sort of vanish from there. The state discourages mobilizations in this new phase, and as a result of which distributive claims are not articulated, could not be presented to the state. More recently, as we have read in the newspapers, the state discourages functioning of NGOs and civil society organizations. Most recent example, that of Amnesty International. So at various levels, there is an exclusion, near complete exclusion of certain kind of democratic claims which were asserted earlier. Then what happens to the arena of representation? The key arena of representation, where, as I said, a dual discourse of democracy unfolds. So, for example, the substantial representative claims are curtailed, but at the same time, there is a facade of representation. There is an apparent mechanism, instruments, channels of representation, which are unleashed and supported by the state. All these channels are not essentially unleashed by the state, but they are supported by the state. Let's take some example. We can talk about institutional decline and institutional lopsidedness, the lopsidedness of the institutions as one kind of marker. There is a lot of tweaking of the institutions, right? And again, today was an example of that. But this tweaking of the institutions does not bother the people, so to say, and why I'll come to that in a minute. But there is a certain kind of tweaking of the institutions, and procedural democracy imagines a kind of checks and balance principle. It works on the basis of checks and balance principle that is disrupted in a major way in this period, and yet the claims of representation remain intact. So what are the mechanisms? One mechanism is something that scholars have described as arrival of a majoritarian state. So the cultural majority and demographic majority is transformed into political majority in a very successful manner. And we may perhaps recall this Partha Chatterjee's discussion about nation state. There is a certain logic of nation state and what he calls as people nation. The idea of nationalism that emerges within people, or how people sort of consolidate the idea of nationalism. But there is a complete overlap between the two when a majoritarian state arrives on the scene. So that becomes one possible way, by creating a new community, which essentially excludes and definitely excludes certain kind of citizens. But it creates a new rationale of community and swiftly swiftly introduces it to the modern concept of democracy, the framework of modern liberal democracy. Some people have called it the arrival of ethnic democracy in their theorization. But the state endorses majoritarianism, and a new kind of, rather than electoral majority, a new kind of majority is created. The other area, the other channel for this dual discourse of democracy is the arrival of social media and the simultaneous arrival of surveillance. The growth of media, the spread of media, essentially also leads to a discourse of surveillance, a discourse of vigilance. So that strengthens, that consolidates the state, the discourse of vigilance. You see CCTVs everywhere. You see every action and every thought being monitored. But at the same time, because of the presence of social media, you have a sense of being represented within the realm of the state. I'm just talking about these contradictory sort of forces that are operating in our society, as well as, and how the state sort of uses those to subvert the democratic logic. Yeah. My another point, another aspect that I want to talk about in this connection is the middle classization of the entire political discourse. A new political culture emerges in which the middle class is prioritized, middle class identity is prioritized at various levels, and we can discuss those examples maybe later on. But so an agency is given to the middle class, not through electoral politics essentially, but otherwise. So a new kind of political culture which grants agency to middle class and is endorsed. This agency is endorsed by the state. When the state says that you stay home, it is essentially a middle class discourse, because the state is not bothered about all those people, many of those people who are homeless and therefore can't stay home. So in that sense, I'm talking about the middle class agency. And finally, it is also about authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is now seen in terms of the state was able to convert it into the idea of strong leadership, belief in strong leadership. So authoritarianism, the idea of authoritarianism, if it is seen in the slightly negative sense, then you have the idea of strong leadership, which then gives you a sense of empowerment and representation. And finally, there is also this ideology called populism. And there again, I would go back to Partha Chatterjee's recent discussion, where he sort of talks about governmental populism and also ideological populism. And in India, in many European and many other states, we see governmental populism, rise of governmental populism. But in the Indian context, very specifically, it's a combination of governmental populism, the distrust of elites, the distrust of democracy, the distrust of certain kind of ideologies, but it is also combined with a very strong ideological populism. And that gives you a sense of empowerment, that gives the citizens a sense of empowerment without investing into the nitty-gritties of procedural democracy. So at that level, I'm trying to suggest that there is an alternative logic, democratic logic or pseudo democratic logic that is emerging in Indian society, which is again very cleverly appropriated by the state, won over by the state, to such an extent that now it does not depend on the procedural, formal, substantial democracy for its survival or for its legitimation. So this near complete manipulation of the very democratic logic itself, rather than small claims, this and that, those that's claim, the very complete manipulation of the democratic logic itself, it leads to notional inclusion of the people in this alternative discourse of representation, but it also leads to substantive exclusion of the people. So it becomes a more exclusionary logic in that sense. And here I would like to remind you of the work by Ziblatt and Levitsky on how democracies die. And they say that democracies die through internal mechanisms, certain internal mechanisms only. But I would stop here.
All right, Dr. Deshpande, thank you very much.